The Battle of Cannae. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC stands as one of the most devastating military failures in Roman history, and a powerful example of what happens when pride outweighs strategy. At the time, Rome was locked in a brutal struggle with the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who had already humiliated Roman forces in earlier battles. Determined to crush him once and for all, the Roman Republic assembled an enormous army, nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, the largest force they had ever put in the field. Their plan was simple and aggressive: punch through the center of Hannibal's line and rely on their superior numbers to win by sheer force. But Hannibal anticipated this move and devised a far more cunning strategy. He placed his weakest troops, Spanish and Gallic infantry, in the center and allowed them to gradually fall back under the Roman assault. As the Romans surged forward into what seemed like an easy victory, they were unknowingly stepping into a trap. Hannibal's stronger African infantry, stationed on the wings, closed in from both sides, while his cavalry, having already routed the Roman horsemen, swept around to attack from the rear. In a matter of hours, the Roman army was completely surrounded, trapped in a shrinking circle of steel and death. The soldiers were packed so tightly they could barely move, let alone fight, and thousands were cut down where they stood. It became a massacre. Ancient sources estimate that between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, an almost unimaginable loss, including high-ranking officers and one of the consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The scale of the disaster sent shockwaves through Rome, which was thrown into chaos and despair. Streets filled with mourning citizens, temples held desperate rituals, and leaders feared the very survival of the Republic was at stake. The battle was a crushing blow, not only to Roman military strength but also to Roman confidence. The Battle of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, was a major English victory during the Hundred Years' War, and a major failure for the French despite their advantages. The French army outnumbered the English and had far more heavily armed knights and men-at-arms. Confident in their strength, the French expected an easy win, but they badly underestimated the power and effectiveness of the English longbow. Before the battle, English archers had placed sharp wooden stakes in the ground to protect themselves. When the French cavalry tried to charge, they were stopped by the stakes and trapped under heavy arrow fire. At the same time, French foot soldiers struggled to cross the muddy, narrow battlefield. Weighed down by their armor, they moved slowly and were easy targets for the English archers. By the time the French reached the English lines, they were exhausted, disorganized, and already weakened by thousands of arrows. The English forces, though tired and outnumbered, held their ground and fought back fiercely. In the end, the French suffered massive losses, around 10 times more than the English. Their defeat came not just from the mud and arrows, but from poor planning, overconfidence, and a failure to adapt. Agincourt became a turning point in the war and showed that skill, preparation, and smart use of technology could beat numbers and brute strength. For the French, it was a costly reminder that even the strongest army can lose if it underestimates its enemy. The Battle of Carrhae. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC was a military and strategic disaster brought about by the arrogance and poor judgment of Marcus Licinius Crassus. Eager to match the military glory of his rivals, Julius Caesar and Pompey, Crassus set off for the east, hoping to conquer Parthia and secure wealth and fame. But from the very beginning, his decisions were riddled with errors. He ignored seasoned advice to travel through the safer, mountainous route offered by his Armenian allies, and instead led his army, over 40,000 strong, into the flat, open desert of Mesopotamia, perfect terrain for the Parthian cavalry. Deceived by a local guide and overconfident in his own strength, Crassus marched his forces into unfamiliar and punishing terrain, where the Parthians, under their brilliant general Surenas, awaited with a far smaller but vastly more mobile army of horse archers and armoured cataphracts. Crassus formed his men into a large square formation in the belief that it would protect them, but it instead made them a perfect target. Slow-moving and tightly packed, unable to respond to the relentless rain of arrows from Parthian archers who could fire while retreating on horseback. When his son Publius attempted a breakout with Roman cavalry, he too was lured into a trap, surrounded, and killed. The Parthians then used Publius's severed head to demoralize the remaining Romans. Crassus himself was soon tricked into peace talks where he was killed, either during a skirmish or, according to legend, by having molten gold poured down his throat as a symbol of his greed. The battle cost Rome around 20,000 lives, with another 10,000 taken prisoner and multiple legionary eagles, sacred military standards, lost, an act so shameful they weren't recovered for over 3 decades. Carrhae was a catastrophic failure of leadership, born from pride, impatience, and a complete misunderstanding of both the terrain and the enemy's strengths. It shattered Roman invincibility, destabilized Rome's fragile political balance, and marked a turning point that contributed to the end of the Roman Republic. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. After taking power in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte led France to victory after victory, building an empire that stretched across much of Europe. He took control of regions like Belgium, Holland, parts of Italy, Germany, and Poland, and forced many countries to become his allies, except for Britain, which remained defiant, and eventually Russia. To hurt Britain's economy, Napoleon set up a trade blockade called the Continental System. But by 1810, Russian leader Tsar Alexander I stopped following it because it was damaging Russia's own economy. Napoleon made things worse by forming a Polish state from lands Russia once ruled and trying to marry the Tsar's sister, which offended the Russian court. In 1812, Napoleon decided to invade Russia with a massive army of soldiers from all over Europe, possibly as many as 650,000. But the Russians avoided direct battles, instead retreating and burning everything behind them so the French army would find no supplies. Napoleon's soldiers soon faced hunger, exhaustion, and disease. Finally, on September 7th, the two sides met at the bloody Battle of Borodino, near Moscow. Around 70,000 men were killed or wounded, but the Russians still retreated, and Napoleon's army reached Moscow, only to find it abandoned and on fire. Napoleon waited in the burning city for peace talks, but they never came. As winter approached, he had no choice but to retreat. The journey back was a nightmare. Freezing cold, no food, constant Russian attacks, and disease wiped out most of the army. By the time they crossed the Berezina River in November, only about 100,000 soldiers remained. Napoleon rushed back to Paris, leaving his men behind. The disastrous invasion inspired other countries, like Austria and Prussia, to rise up against him. Though he managed to raise another army, it wasn't strong enough. Napoleon was defeated in 1813, forced into exile in 1814, and after one final attempt to regain power, was finally beaten for good at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme, fought from July to November 1916 during World War I, is remembered as one of the deadliest and most disappointing battles in history. It was planned by the British and French to break through German defences, help their allies at Verdun, and change the course of the war. Before the attack, they spent a week firing thousands of shells to destroy German trenches, but the bombardment didn't work as expected. When the soldiers finally went over the top on July 1st, they found the enemy still strong and ready. German machine guns and barbed wire stopped the advance almost immediately. On that first day alone, the British suffered nearly 57,000 casualties, including over 19,000 who were killed. It was the worst day in British military history. The battle continued for over 4 months in muddy, dangerous conditions. Despite all the effort and sacrifice, the Allies only gained about 6 miles of ground. By the end, more than 1 million soldiers from both sides had been killed, wounded, or gone missing, over 600,000 from the British and French, and about 450,000 from the Germans. The battle showed that the old ways of fighting didn't work against modern weapons like machine guns and powerful artillery. Leaders kept using outdated tactics, sending troops into open ground with little chance of success.